All right, so you ready to go?
Let's go.
All right, I am so happy that Professor Landsmark can join us in person to talk a little bit about himself and to talk, of course, although he's had to do this thousands of times at this point, he has very generously agreed to talk to us about the photograph that won the Pulitzer Prize, The Soiling of Old Glory, and the day, I guess, the events on the day that occurred. So a little bit about Professor Landsmark. Right now, he's Distinguished Professor of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and Director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. But he actually served for 17 years as president of the Boston Architectural College and has a real interest in design and policy issues. And before that, he was trained as a lawyer. And during the days in the 70s, he was working. He was a lawyer and working more in legal affairs. So first, I thought I would just share my screen and show everybody who hasn't seen it the picture. That's a close-up. I wanted to get the bigger one. And so this is the photograph. This is the photograph that became, I guess we would call it in today's terms, viral. That became the subject of an enormous amount of attention, and I think really created a sort of a moment of consideration, right, of where people were at, and what the tensions were and the fault lines in American society. Although Professor Landsmark can talk more to that, and I'll just show a little bit of a photograph with a few more sequences for context. This is the top three are actually before, I think, before the flag incident, the actual flag was swung at Professor Landsmark, and the bottom two are clearly after, the bottom left being immediately after, and the bottom right being at a press conference, I believe a couple days later. And that is the photograph for people to sort of absorb what's going on there. And now I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to ask Professor Landsmark just to say a few words. Well, really to say what's going on. You were to give the students a little bit background. You were involved in the civil rights movement in college. In fact, you went down to Selma to march. But then you became a lawyer, you moved to Boston, worked in Boston for a couple of years, and from what I understand, became a community activist. And that was the context of you being at City Hall that day. So that's just sort of bring the students up to speed. And I was wondering if you could just tell us what happened on that day. What were you doing there, and what happened in that scene that we were looking at?
Well, it's great to be talking to the students about this subject, and we've had previous conversations about this, and I've also had some additional time to reflect on the kinds of comments that I make, and it's very interesting that you have found a photograph that I don't think I ever saw. And that was the image of me very shortly after the attack, when I was still wearing the suit I'd been wearing that day. I've often talked about being covered with blood and my nose being broken, but I don't think I'd ever seen that photograph of me standing clearly on the same day. And not that photograph, but one of the one on the lower left there. Shortly after the attack itself, and clearly that shows that I was kind of bruised and damaged on that day. And I think it's also interesting to take a look at the photograph at the upper left there, because what it shows in the sequence is that there was one other African-American man on City Hall Plaza that day. I have never met him, but he had apparently just left a meeting and saw that I was being attacked, obviously, because I was right next to him. And he ducked and ran, and I was already being attacked. But what is most interesting about that first image, I think, is that you can see the flag in the background. So it's clear that the flag bearer decided upon seeing the attack that he would circle around the crowd and come at me with the flag. It was not something that was purely spontaneous. He had to give some thought to running the 50 yards or so that he had to run to bring the flag around to attack me. And that gives me an interesting added perspective on all of this, because a lot of people have been able to get away with saying, oh, he just happened to be there. And in an instant he decided, but it's pretty clear from this sequence of photographs, which did take place before the flag was swung at me, that he gave it some thought. And that he really had an intent to do some harm to me. And as I've noted in the past, in his career, he went on to other kinds of violent activities in his community in South Boston that led him, according to press reports, ultimately to be banished from South Boston by the local culture and to have to work in Boston, but to have to live outside of town because the culture in South Boston said that he was simply not an appropriate member of the community. And the only reason he had any kind of protection was that his brother was in the Longshoremen's Union, and his brother had a lot of sway with who got hired to work on the docks in South Boston. And so his brother was able to prevail so that he could continue to work, but he could no longer live in South Boston. I was on my way to a meeting in City Hall to talk about affirmative action and efforts to try to increase the number of jobs that were available to people of color in certain neighborhoods. I mean, we weren't even lobbying for construction work in downtown. We were trying to get construction work in neighborhoods that at the time were primarily Black and Latinx, that is to say in Roxbury and the South End. And there were some major housing developments being built at that point in time. And I was a lawyer and advocate on behalf of what we then called minority contractors, that is to say, builders and subcontractors who were involved with the building trades, who were themselves people of color, many of whom lived within the city of Boston. And they saw a lot of builders and contractors coming in from other neighborhoods. Then, as is the case now, a lot of builders and contractors lived in suburbs around Boston. They lived in New Hampshire. They lived in Rhode Island. And they commuted into town every morning in order to work on projects in Roxbury and in the South End and in parts of Dorchester. And people in the neighborhoods, after a period of time, felt that it simply wasn't fair that on public jobs, in particular, jobs that were being financed by the city of Boston or by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that all of the work was going to people who were white and who lived in suburbs, but that the people who lived in those communities were not given opportunities to be in the training programs and to work in those jobs and to be able to take profits out of that work. And in fact, in looking back at it, looking back 30 or 40 years, one of the reasons that Boston, in one of the Federal Reserve Bank's most recent studies, showed that people of color had a net worth of $8 per family, while white families had a net worth of $247,500 per family, is that that net worth was largely based on families' ability to buy a house and to have that house go up in value. And that Black people in the city, Latinx people in the city, were not given the same opportunities to simply buy a home and to ride the inflation of that home upwards. So even at the time of this photograph in 1976, there was an awareness that if you don't give people educational opportunities and you don't give people the opportunity to save their money in their homes, to get the kinds of loans that white people in the suburbs were able to get, that ultimately there are long-term negative economic implications for the ability of people of color to stay in the city. And one of those long-term economic implications is that ultimately, when more white people wanted to move back into the city, they were able to gentrify neighborhoods because Black people could no longer afford to live there. But white people who had benefited from the discrimination that had taken place over the years were able to move into those neighborhoods that Black people were not permitted to work in and build in, but which white people from the suburbs had.
They had the capital to displace them.
Right, and the capital didn't just come from outside the community. You know, it's often misrepresented that Black people in the communities were simply looking for some sort of welfare handout. That was not the case. People wanted to build their own communities from within. They wanted to buy a home. They wanted to invest in a business. They wanted to build up capital within the community. They wanted to build economic strength within the communities, but the banks wouldn't lend. The builders wouldn't provide construction jobs in the communities. And I think most importantly, from a policy point of view, the public agencies that were commissioning the work in those neighborhoods tolerated a pattern of discrimination against people of color in those neighborhoods in a way that made it virtually impossible for a hard-working construction worker to really become a homeowner in that community and to then plow capital back into the community that enabled the community to support itself and to really be able to overcome a kind of colonial sense that money always came into a community through white people who worked in the community, but could not stay in the community because Black people who worked hard had the opportunity to invest in their own communities.
And of course, the patronage networks played an enormous role in that too, is ensuring that these contracts, these different modes of employment in the city went to sort of in groups.
Well, that is certainly the case, and people focus on busing, but folks have to remember that for at least a half a century prior to the federal court order mandating that Boston schools be integrated with the transfer of students from one neighborhood to another as the means of bringing about that integration, the electorate, the voters in Boston had year after year elected to the city council and into the mayor's office individuals who perpetuated patterns of racist behavior. Implicit bias was built in and supported by people who voted in the city. And that meant that the fire department, the police department, the housing authority, the court system, the transportation system were all under court orders to open up because there were patterns that said that if you were white and you belonged to certain families and came from certain neighborhoods, you could go to work in a public agency or in many private jobs, for example, at Gillette and at the phone company and at all of the utilities. They were all based upon who you knew, and they all excluded African Americans and Latinx people from any kinds of employment opportunities. And so the city, while it had a reputation for being progressive and liberal, was in fact, along with many other American cities like New York, like Chicago, like Los Angeles, like Phoenix, the city was a bastion of implicit bias that favored white supremacy and that excluded hardworking African American and Latinx families from education and for opportunities to reinvest whatever they earned in their own communities.
So, and on that particular day, you're going into City Hall to talk about all of these issues that you're talking about now, about affirmative action, about creating opportunities for people of color within the city, and battling that implicit bias that exists.
With a focus on one particular project that was being built in Boston's South End. It was the Villa Victoria project, which has subsequently proven to be really a wonderful home for primarily a lot of people who came in from Puerto Rico and have built their families and have really built up a very strong Latinx community in the South End. But we could see that there would be hundreds of construction jobs and that virtually none of them were going to go to people from that community or to Latinx people from the greater Boston community. And that seemed very unfair to us. And so my goal on that day was to have a conversation with the city's planning agency to talk about setting aside a certain number of jobs for qualified workers so that they could end up working in their own community.
That's really interesting. And I took a group of students actually we walked over to Villa Victoria and talked about it there. So that really is an interesting tie-in, and the extent to which, I told them, the expression, you can't fight City Hall. Well, in the case of Villa Victoria, you actually could, right? This was a parcel of land that the community successfully took ownership of for development when it was intended for a different use. So,
and it's also the case that my job as the head of a construction contractors trade association for people of color, my job was to serve as a bridge between the demonstrations that had taken place in the community prior to our setting up the meeting, and then my ability to actually go into City Hall as a lawyer, as a well-trained professional, to then negotiate on behalf of the community what the specific terms would be that would lead to the setting aside of a certain number of jobs for qualified workers that would go back into the community so the community could build up its equity.
Yeah. And just for the students to understand, though, the context on that particular day, though, the people outside were not protesting your activities per se. They were there because of the busing issue, and I think they were there specifically to meet with Louise Day Hicks, who was at that time a city councilor. Had previously run for mayor, had made her name on the Boston Schools Committee, and was sort of rabble rouser in chief. But I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about, what they were doing there, what you were doing there, and what happened. Just the sort of the straight what happened, in the photos we saw.
Well, I didn't know that a demonstration was taking place, and I certainly didn't know that a group of high school students would be meeting with a city councilor whom everyone knew was basically racist. There's been a very good podcast called Fiasco that has documented her apparent change of heart from being someone who might have been viewed initially as a moderate to position that she ran on, where essentially it was clear that she was standing up for white families and against Black families. But I didn't know that there was a meeting going on. I was simply on my way to a meeting on a different floor in City Hall. I was walking in one direction in that passageway towards City Hall. The students came from around the corner in an opposite direction. I mean, if I had seen the demonstrators coming, I would not have walked into that kind of crowd. I would have stepped aside and let them go by.
Yeah.
But there wasn't enough time to do that. They came around the corner as I was coming around the corner, and we ran into each other. And they didn't know that they were about to attack someone who had been a civil rights activist to any more of an extent that I knew that they were a group of busing students. Certainly I knew that when I saw the front of the crowd, and thought that I could simply walk past it. But I had no idea that a demonstration was going on at that time. And in fact, you know, it's a reminder that many of us see terrible things going on around us. And because we think that those terrible things are not going to affect us personally, we have a way of being complacent and of saying, well, this is not going to impact on me. We've certainly seen that in 2020, for example, around the COVID pandemic, where we know that nearly 250,000 people, Americans, have died. And we know that there are things that we can do, like wearing masks and doing social distancing and the like. And yet many people continue to gather. They continue to go to restaurants. They continue to be inside. And they act as though it's not something that is going to impact them directly until it does. And in this case, even though I'd been in Boston a couple of years and had a family, the point was I didn't have any kids. And so it occurred to me that busing and everything that was going on in the schools really wasn't going to have any kind of impact on me at all. And that I would just live a quiet life as an advocate and not be directly impacted. And I think that what happened because of the photograph in particular is that a lot of people in Boston realized that the impact of the violence that was going on in the city was something that had a negative impact on all kinds of people, including people who were not directly involved on one side or the other, because I hadn't been involved on one side or the other. And I think that there was a kind of coming to grips with the fact that people in the suburbs and people who ran the businesses and people who were elected officials, but not necessarily from South Boston or from Roxbury, were all impacted negatively by the violence that was going on around them, and that they had to stand up and do something, that it wasn't good enough to simply be complacent and silent, that in fact, what was going on, in fact, impacted on the quality of life and the ethics, the sense of justice and fairness for everyone who lived in the region.
That's really fascinating because I mean, we're talking about an awakening moment, right? The sort of power of visualization to to make people aware of something that was not within their conscience, conscious previously.
Well, of course, we see that now because people's cell phones are so ubiquitous. Many of the attacks that we've seen by police officers on people of color over the last couple of years would not have gotten the kind of visibility that they've gotten had it not been for the fact that they were filmed.
Yeah.
They were caught on cell phones. They were widely distributed. In 1976, people didn't have that opportunity to provide a kind of ground level documentation of the kind of brutality that many of us in community of colors had gotten used to, but those acts were not being seen by a wider community.
Mhm.
So today, when we see people being beaten, when we see people essentially being killed in front of us on video, there is a revulsion that takes place because it is impossible to deny that those horrible negative things are happening. And so to a large extent, what social media has done, both here and abroad, for example, in the Arab Spring and elsewhere around the world, has been to provide a kind of visual documentation that is highly impactful in a way that simply writing about the same incidents has not had the same impact over the years. I remember, for example, hearing as a kid who was growing up in New York, stories of lynchings. And I would think, oh, this is a horrible thing. But until I saw the first photographs of African Americans and Chinese and Latinx people across the United States hanging from trees with crowds of people surrounding them, cheering and jeering and taking photographs of each other and celebrating the fact that as vigilantes, they had gone out, broken into jails, pulled people out of cars, pulled people off of the steps of courthouses, taken them out into the woods and hung them from trees. Until I saw the pictures, it never occurred to me that those things were as real as they were to the people who were in those communities. Now, anyone with a cell phone has the opportunity and, in fact, the obligation to disseminate that kind of image in a way that helps us lead to a greater sense of social justice, because we can't deny that those horrible things are happening.
Yeah, and I think that's that's absolutely right. The way that this has become, that video and the fact that most people are carrying around something that can record has become an instrument of social justice. But what's interesting to me is that even with all, with all of the availability of powerful images and powerful videos out there, you do still have sometimes one image, right? That thinking of the young 3-year-old boy who drowned migrating the Mediterranean, and the photograph of him on the beach. With everything out there, that one image really shook people, right? And that's why I think even with sort of everything that's out there now, right, this image still would shake people. And it's interesting because I think any number, I'm just going to share the screen for a second more. And this is from Stanley Foreman's own website, but any number of these images, these are very powerful images, and any number of these images would have been startling. They're all powerful. This whole sequence is powerful. And yet, I mean, here, two men under attack, and you can see the flag in the background, as you pointed out, and running away, all incredibly powerful images. And yet that one image, right? That one image, if I can get there, I'm sorry to do this to you. It must be, difficult to sort of see yourself under attack. But, this one image did what none of the others did, right? In terms of capturing that moment. And clearly it had something to do with the flag and the symbolic value of the flag. So I was wondering
That's
if you had
absolutely.
any thoughts on why this one image, out of all very powerful, difficult, disturbing images, shook everybody in the way that it did.
Well, of course, this took place in a bicentennial year where the country was prepared to celebrate American independence and justice and democracy, and was prepared to say in the April before the July 4th celebrations that we were a great and free country where everyone had opportunities to succeed. And the fact that this was an American flag being used, the symbol of freedom and justice of liberty and liberty, really underlined the fact that all of the myths that we had told ourselves about social justice and equality and how Boston was the cradle of liberty was largely a lie. There's wonderful work that's been done by the historian Joe Lepore that points out that America has always been a violent country, that at the time of the writing of the Constitution, women were not permitted to vote. African Americans, who constituted a very large percentage of the American population, particularly in the South, were not permitted to vote. And so we often say, well, there was equality at some level in 1776, but the only people who were permitted to vote at that time were landed white men. And they were the ones who wrote the Constitution. And you get the sense that the only violence that they were involved with was violence that was imposed on them by British soldiers. But the fact is that from the time of the Pilgrims, those settlers used violent means to eliminate Native American people, to drive out Latinx people from parts of the country. Women and people of color were excluded from the American democracy, and that violence has been endemic throughout this country's history. And it's hard for us to have to acknowledge the truth of that. But the fact of the matter is we have used violence and the American flag as a symbol of democracy at the same time that we have taken rights away, taken land away, deprived people of their rights since the founding of this republic. And until we come to grips with that reality, until we acknowledge and hold up a mirror to ourselves around all of that, we're never really going to move forward to be the kind of country that we want to be, that is as welcoming as we purport to be. And so seeing the American flag used in this way in a bicentennial year really undercut the myth that America is as open and democratic and fair to everyone as we purport to be. Looking at that sequence of photographs from Stanley's website is really instructive, because it reminds me of people who asked, what did I say to the crowd to make them so angry at me? What did I do? I mean, did I make an obscene gesture? Did I say something negative to them? But the fact of the matter is, even if I wanted to, I didn't have time to do any of that. They simply saw me and the one other person on City Hall Plaza. And because we represented what they thought was being taken away from them, they set on both of us, but primarily on me, as innocent victims of violence. And they felt as though they were right to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you bring up a really interesting point in terms of the sort of the unprovoked nature of the violence. I know that in the aftermath, that you were very careful, or your intentions were to primarily focus on the adults, right? On those who stirred these youths up. And not on the young people themselves. That this was, from what I understand, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but this was sort of your intentional, thoughtful approach in order for the incident itself to be some sort of vehicle towards improvement in the situation. But it's funny, because in preparing for this class and learning more about Boston and reading on the struggles of integration and the continued segregation in the city, and particularly around the issue of busing. I sometimes worry if too much focus is placed on the Louise Day Hickses and Whitey Bulger, as this crime boss who controlled the neighborhoods, and that we sometimes let the mob off a little easy, right? I mean, you talked about the sort of in lynching, the sort of celebratory the sort of happy atmosphere. And when you look at some of these images, right, you can see the sort of carnivalesque, mobbish atmosphere, and certainly in terms of the way people responded in Southie, not in terms of sending their kids to Catholic schools or moving to the suburbs or whatever sort of non-violent responses there were, but in terms of violence, of throwing rocks at buses and surrounding the school on incidents and harassing Black students. Often, the chants, bust them back to Africa, right? There seems to have been a moral failing. There seems to have been a sort of a moment of difficulty distinguishing right from wrong that I almost worry if we excuse it too much by focusing on the political leaders and so on. Anyway, that's just something that I've been thinking about, and I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Well, I think we do need to look at the wider culture. When the city was mandated by the federal courts to integrate all of its public services and to open up jobs and the like, white families in South Boston and elsewhere who did not want to give up their implicit white supremacy, where they had the economic means to do so, sold their houses in South Boston and moved to Quincy and other parts of the South Shore, south of Boston. And
I live in West Roxbury. Right.
They moved to West Roxbury. They moved out of the neighborhoods that were most likely to be impacted. And if the families couldn't afford to move to a different neighborhood, if they felt trapped in South Boston, they pulled their kids out of the public schools and they enrolled them in parochial schools, primarily the Catholic schools. If you look at the patterns of enrollment in parochial schools in Boston during that period, enrollments exploded upward. And that was a moment when one would have hoped that the leadership of the Catholic Church, which of course subsequently became implicated in a lot of sexual scandals during that period as well, which were uncovered by the Boston Globe. But
one would have coming to our class the week after, actually.
Well, there you go. And so one would have hoped that the religious leadership would have stepped up and shown a kind of effort to bring people back together. And they didn't do that. Mm-hmm. One would have thought that you would have seen in some of the companies in Gillette and in Bank of Boston and in the Shawmut Bank, an effort made to bring more people of color into the kinds of lending roles and the kind of employment roles that would have changed things. One would have hoped and thought that the universities, including Northeastern, would have done more outreach to include people from Boston and the local communities in the opportunities that our great universities have provided. And if they had done that, you would see now in many leadership roles, primarily in the private sector, a much more diverse group of individuals.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting.
But that kind of moral leadership didn't exist. And again, we've seen that just in the past couple of years as discrepancies between who's been dying of COVID and who feels that they still have privileges where they don't have to do anything about that, has perpetuated a number of class and race distinctions between people that now have to be healed. And the reason I speak at length about this, particularly to our students and to young people, is that we've always been a divided country. We've had civil wars and we've had other kinds of skirmishes that have gone on for a long time. And we will always have differences of opinion about any of a range of subjects, but those differences of opinion don't have to then devolve into hatred that then takes the form of violence against people who aren't the same or who don't hold the same viewpoints that we may hold. And it's important for young people in particular to realize that they are often at the forefront of healing, of bringing people together, of working with each other, of taking the time to listen to each other, to try to find those points of commonality between themselves. I think of conversations that Mayor Ray Flynn, with whom I subsequently worked, and I used to have, about the fact that he had become mayor after rising from South Boston and being opposed to busing, but having a family made up of two working class parents. His father worked on the docks and his mother was a homemaker. And I had grown up in the projects in East Harlem with a single mom. And both of us had been in positions where we had been told that education was going to be the one thing that would enable us to move on and to climb up the economic and social ladder. And he and I used to have conversations about how when he was a kid, he used to hitchhike with truck drivers down to New York City to learn to play basketball with the kids, the Black kids in the neighborhood I grew up in. And I didn't know that. I don't think a lot of people in South Boston knew that when he was leading some of the anti-busing demonstrations. But he and I both understood that we'd grown up in working class families, that we shared a lot of values, and that when it came to a lot of issues, there would be some things that we would disagree on. But in terms of providing opportunities, particularly through education, for lots of working class kids who would not otherwise have the opportunity to climb the social ladder, we were on exactly the same page. And the same goes with a lot of issues today. There's a lot of fear expressed about different groups of people and how they're going to respond to each other. But at the moment when we begin to sit down and just hear each other, it turns out that we have a lot more in common than not. None of us want to get sick. None of us want to have our families taken away from us. None of us believe that the economy shouldn't be in a position to recover. We all want the same things. We may disagree on how to get there, but then it becomes a matter of figuring out from a policy point of view how we come to common ground around those policies in a way that makes progress possible, rather than just shouting at each other and perpetuating disagreements that don't have to exist.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that's a great point, and I think that that's actually one of sort of the tragedies of the resistance to busing and resistance to integration, is how much it did exacerbate pre-existing economic disparity between communities, right? So, you know, yeah, there was a large number of people who went to Catholic schools and went to you know, and moved out of the neighborhoods or moved to suburbs. But the response of many who remained was also to drop out. And in Charlestown and in South Boston, the dropout rate went through the roof. And I mean, to me, that's it's very perplexing because of exactly what you said in terms of the opportunities that education provide, and the ability for young people to do this sort of healing and to demonstrate coexistence. Because, in other places where integration had been forced by the state, very often there was also intense resistance to the court orders, but then once they happened, they integrated, right? In much of the South, that's what happened, right? Integration was pretty successful in the schools in the South, whereas here, uh, this resistance after essentially they had lost, to choose, let's say, dropping out, or fighting it, or boycotting it. I mean, it seems so self-defeating, and I think sometimes the agency is taken away from many people who made these problematic choices.
Yeah, it's very interesting that Charleston, South Carolina, had a Black police chief decades before Boston did. Savannah, Georgia had a Black mayor decades before it appears Boston will. And in fact, even in some place like Natchez, Mississippi, it was not that long ago that the city elected its first Black gay mayor. And we see the same in Chicago at this point. And yet many New England cities, although we provide, we say to ourselves that we're very liberal and progressive, we're very far behind the South in that regard. And integration did take place in a number of American cities much more successfully than in Boston, because there was an understanding that the shared values of the city were more important than continuing to perpetuate division. For me, one of the most poignant extended moments I had was when I worked in City Hall overseeing employment and training programs for the city. And some of those programs were located in Charlestown. And many of them were adult education programs where we were providing literacy and job training to white families, and white men in particular, who had dropped out of school during busing. And because they didn't even have a high school diploma, they were only in a position to work at low-level public service jobs or in the local candy making factory at Schraff's.
Yeah.
And then when Schraff's closed, many of the local employers decided to step forward and to try to provide work for those individuals. Mass General and some of the other hospitals stepped up and said, we're prepared to employ the people who are being laid off by this candy maker. But the fact of the matter was that in order to work at Mass General, you had to have a high school diploma.
Yeah.
And these then adults were unable to take advantage of those jobs. And so they came into the employment and training programs that I was running. And they would come to me at the end of community meetings and express their gratitude to me for being the person who had been willing to overcome being attacked in order to finally help them get the education that they had missed out on so that they could feed their families. It was, for me, a very touching moment, and one which, of course, I wish, they hadn't had to experience. But the fact of the matter is, at this moment, part of the divide that's taking place around the country is the divide between those people who can get a college degree, like the students who are seeing this, and those who don't. And we've got to begin to show a greater level of empathy for those who aren't getting a college degree, because they're Americans too. And we depend on them for all kinds of work, whether it's as plumbers or as the people who clean the airplanes at Logan Airport or run restaurants. We're all part of one extended community. And as fortunate as we are to be able to attend the best colleges in America, we are heavily dependent on other people who don't have the privileges that we do. And we need to remind ourselves that we're all part of one shared community.
Yeah, so I think that that's actually a perfect place for me to because I want to let you go back to your Sunday. So it's a perfect place for me to sort of ask my last question, which is about where Boston is now and where you see us going. Do you see any? And you can say no if you don't see any cause for hope. But do you see any cause for hope in the future? Around the issues that we've been talking about, and in particular integration, because Boston continues to be extremely segregated. And in fact, I often say, talking about the sort of difference between here and the South, is that in Boston, segregation has been so successful that white people can pretend that it's not segregated. African Americans are so out of the way, that out of their vision, that the many in Boston have no idea just how segregated it is.
Well,
Do you see any improvement in the future? Any Where do you see us going? That's a loaded question. I want to ask you a loaded question. I'll leave it open and just ask, where do you see us going?
well, both as an academic, as a long-term resident of Boston, and as a member of the city's planning board, I can see where there certainly are areas of progress. In our elected officials, for example, one looks at the Boston City Council today, where a majority of the council members are women, and that was not the case 25 years ago. Where a majority of those women are women of color from all over the city. That was certainly not the case 25 years ago. We see that in a number of public sector positions, with people heading up agencies and really overseeing a lot of public policy. So to that extent, we've made significant progress. We have made many steps backward in a number of other areas. For example, there are fewer students of color from the United States in most of our universities today than there were 20 or 25 years ago. African Americans and Latinx students from the United States are fewer in number today on many of our New England campuses than was the case a quarter of a century ago. The real estate industry, the banking industry, the finance industry are all as racially segregated today as they were 50 years ago. And a lot of people say, oh, well, they're family-run businesses or what have you. But the fact of the matter is, the private sector in not just the greater Boston area, but throughout New England, has failed to open its doors to education and employment in ways that reflect what the demographics of the area are. Boston is right now a city where a majority of the residents are people of color. But if you go to any of the bars on in the Seaport, if you go to many of the restaurants and clubs in the Back Bay, you would never know that. If you go to many of our public venues, and that includes Fenway Park or a hockey game, you would have no idea that the majority of people who live in Boston proper are people of color. There's a reason for that.
So I actually moved to Boston from Canada. I grew up in Toronto and then moved to Montreal and then to Boston. And yes, that amazed me as an outsider when I first got here.
It's shocking. I mean, it's utterly shocking to go to a Celtics game and see how few people of color are in the audience. I used to have Celtics seasons tickets, and I would go in, and if I represented, and I and people like me represented 1% of the people in that audience, that was a large number. And that's certainly the case with hockey. And to a large extent, it's the case with our baseball games as well. And it's not entirely because those games are so expensive. And it's also not a matter of overt policy on the part of those sports teams. But what it does reflect is a culture and a pattern of socioeconomic behaviors that excludes people of color from working at a level where they can earn enough to afford to go to those games. It's a pattern that excludes people from residential home ownership. It's a pattern that excludes people of color from owning and running businesses. And it's in those private sector areas that we need to do the most work. The demographics of the area are changing. And the work that has been done largely by students to advocate for social justice over the last couple of years will bring about, I believe, a wave of change in Boston and across the country. But it's also quite clear that there is substantial resistance to that. And that's why when we go home to our families, when we have conversations over the Thanksgiving meal, when we talk to families over the holiday period, we need to be strong in our beliefs that young people represent the future of this country, and that young people are a far more diverse group than has ever been the case in this country, and that we can be welcoming, and that we can look for common ground, and that we don't need to insult each other when we have disagreements with each other, and that in fact we can begin to go through a process of healing. Because if we don't, 5 years from now, 8 years, 10 years from now, the divisions will continue to exist, but the demographics will not have changed. That is to say, the demographics will continue to favor increasing numbers of people of color and increasing numbers of immigrants in the workforce. And woe unto us as a country if we're not welcoming to those changes in the demographics. We're going to learn to get along with each other. It's not going to be easy. And it means that on all sides, we're going to have some difficult and challenging conversations with ourselves that are sometimes going to be really hard and painful. But this is a moment when we can do it. It's a moment when we have to do it. And I think that at this particular moment where there are health crises that should be bringing us together, there are things that we can talk about in terms of our shared values. And now's the time to have those conversations.
There is much to be done. And I think the students are really going to appreciate your words. And I hope also they act on them. So thank you so much for spending your Sunday doing this. I really appreciate it so much, as I know my students will. And it's really been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thanks for the invitation. And I do hope that students will engage themselves as much as they're thinking about their careers in studies in the humanities and studies in the social sciences and those studies that address the tough issues of values and ethics and who we are as people and who our identities are in ways that enable us to really achieve what we think America ought to be and can become as students enter their careers.
Well, there's nothing better to end on than a pitch for the humanities and social sciences. You heard it, students. Thank you so much, Professor Landsmark. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. So